Hello and welcome back. In this video, we'll be entering into a new chapter, which is Chapter 10, Coordination. This chapter is a bit long and it consists of 4 main subtopics, so let's have a look at what those subtopics are. The first of them is 10.1 Nervous System, and 10.2 is learning about the mechanism of muscle contraction. 10.3, we'll learn about hormones in mammals, and last but not least, in 10.4, we'll learn about photoperiodism, that is in plants. So these 4 subtopics are going to be teaching us on how coordination, which is how the cells in one organism communicate with each other in order to perform a certain action or to ensure the organism's survival. So each of these subtopics will be explained in its own video. In this video, we're going to go into 10.1, the nervous system. As usual, before we go into the contents, let's have a look at the learning outcomes. I hope that by the end of this lesson, you will be able to state the organization of the nervous system. You would be able to explain the formation of a resting and action potential. You would be able to describe the characteristics of a nerve impulse, describe the structure of a synapse, explain the mechanism of synaptic transmission across synapses, compare the impulse transmission across synapse and along axons, and also, last but not least, explain the mechanism of action of drugs such as cocaine on the nervous system. So it's quite a lot, so make sure you take your time to digest in between each lesson. Let's begin our lesson by looking at the organization of the nervous system. So just a very quick introduction, your nervous system is a complex network of neurons and cells that carry messages to and from the brain and the spinal cord to various parts of the body. The nervous system includes both the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system will be made up of the brain and the spinal cord, whereas the peripheral nervous system is made up of the somatic and autonomic nervous systems. And this is the functional hierarchy of a human nervous system. So cakap secara ringkas, your nervous system, your sistem saraf, is summarized in this diagram. Okay, kalau kita tengok saja ini diagram, ini sudah merumuskan apa yang dijelaskan tadi. So kalau kamu diminta untuk menyatakan susunan, okay, ataupun hierarchy in nervous system of humans, you can simply draw or restate what is in this diagram. So it's very simple. If there's any parts you don't understand, please feel free to ask. And this is also talking about the nervous system. Here we have diagrams showing the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord. In the diagram on the left, the parts that look reddish is your spinal cord. On the diagram on the right, okay, you have the pale blue, that is your brain and spinal cord. Anything that is outside of your brain and your spinal cord is considered as your peripheral nervous system. So that includes all your peripheral nerves, whether it's going to be connected to a receptor or to a motoneuron or whatever, all that. As long as it's outside, it is peripheral nervous system. Peripheral maksudnya di tepi-tepi. If you look in your notes, you'll notice that there are extra slides with information that are not in your syllabus, and that's what these things are. For this video, I'm going to just go through all that extra information very briefly. I try not to explain them too much. You can feel free to learn more about them in your own time, but if you feel like it's not really your field of interest, you don't have to focus on these slides and just focus on the main points. So let's go with extra information slide number 1. We learn about the central nervous system in more detail. So the central nervous system will include your brain, of course. Your brain will lie within your skull, and the brain consists of 4 principal parts, which is your brainstem, your cerebrum, cerebellum, and diencephalon. Jadi di sini diorang ada nyatakan 4 bahagian dalam otak. So kita boleh bahagikan otak kita kepada brainstem, cerebrum, cerebellum, diencephalon. The brain will weigh approximately 1.3 to 1.4 kilograms. It will have nerve cells called neurons and supporting cells called the glia. The brain will consist of gray matter and white matter. If you look at the structure of the neurons, you'll remember that neurons have cell bodies and axons. Well, the gray matter will be the part that receives and stores impulses. The cell bodies of your neurons and also the cell bodies of neuroglia will be contained in the gray matter. What about the white matter? The white matter will carry impulses to and from the gray matter. It will consist of the nerve fibers, or also called as the axons of the neurons. So kalau kamu potong belah otak tu, kamu boleh nampak dalam otak ada part yang macam kelabu-kelabu, ada part yang macam putih kuning macam tu. Yang kelabu-kelabu itu adalah gray matter, collection of cell bodies, dan yang kuning putih itu adalah white matter, itu mengandungi axon-axon. Let's move on to the second extra information slide. Still on the central nervous system, we learned about the spinal cord. The spinal cord ataupun akar tunjang is a long tube-like structure that extends from your brain. It is composed of a series of 31 segments, and a pair of spinal nerves come out of each segment. Both of your motor and your sensory nerves will be located in the spinal cord. On average, this is what information we have about the spinal cord. On average, it is about 43 centimeters long in adult women and 45 centimeters long in adult men, and it will weigh about 35 to 40 grams. The spinal cord will lie within your vertebral column, which is the collection of bones we call as your backbone. So ini straightforward lah. Kita punya akar tunjang disimpan dalam kita punya tulang belakang. And that is it for the spinal cord. And moving on to slide extra information number 3 is peripheral nervous system. Your peripheral nervous system consists of your sensory and motor division. Sensory division will carry impulse from sensory organs to the central nervous system. Meanwhile, the motor division will carry impulse from central nervous system to the effectors. Jangan lupa, peripheral nervous system termasuk semua saraf-saraf yang di luar daripada otak dan akar tunjang. Jadi, kebanyakan daripada mereka fungsinya adalah untuk detect stimuli, sampaikan stimuli kepada central nervous system. Lepas itu dari central nervous system akan ada arahan baru ataupun impuls baru. Jadi impuls baru daripada central nervous system itu akan dibawa oleh motor division of peripheral nervous system to the effectors. Usually the effectors are muscles or glands. And we also learned about the somatic nervous system. So this is under peripheral nervous system. It is associated with skeletal muscle. So dia sering dikaitkan dan bekerja sama dengan skeletal muscle, yaitu otot-otot besar. They control the voluntary control of body movements and also mediation of involuntary reflex arcs. So this diagram on the left here is showing example of voluntary body movement. Voluntary body movement adalah benda yang kita pikir, kita mau, kita buat. Contoh macam saya perlu angkat selotep ini. So this is by voluntary body movement. You also have involuntary reflex arcs. So your body has ways of reflex that responds to the environment. So contoh macam kalau ada benda menghalak kepada muka kita kan, so something is being thrown at your face. Your eyes will see that and you will reflexively move away or try to block the thing that is going towards your face. Or a very common example of involuntary reflex arc is that thing that doctors do when they take a small little hammer and they hit your knee. So kalau kamu pernah nampak di hospital ataupun dalam kartun, dalam wayang, ada doktor ketuk lutut orang untuk tengok dia pandai tendang ke tidak. Apa yang doktor itu sedang buat adalah dia sedang test sama ada patient itu punya reflex arc berfungsi dengan betul. Okay, when the doctor does that knocking test, he or she is testing to see if your somatic nervous system is functioning correctly. If your leg doesn't kick right away, there might be something wrong within your somatic nervous system. So yeah, it controls all that stuff. And then that's it for the somatic nervous system. Moving on to the next extra information slide, we learned about the autonomic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system is still part of the peripheral nervous system. It controls visceral functions which occur below the levels of consciousness. Visceral functions means things that occur inside of your body. Autonomic nervous system will be divided into the sympathetic division, which corresponds to fight or flight responses, and parasympathetic division, which will mostly focus on self-maintenance functions. Both the sympathetic and parasympathetic division will target the same targets, but the effect will be antagonistic. Kita pernah belajar dalam subtopik-subtopik sebelum ini pasal simpatetik ini mempercepatkan sesuatu proses atau menggalakkan sesuatu proses, manakala parasympathetic division akan melambatkan sesuatu proses. So if you remember the parts of the nervous system that speeds up or slows down some kind of metabolic processes, it's still talking about the same thing. It's the same sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system will control involuntary activities of your internal environment. So you must have thought, what are the examples of this autonomic nervous system? Well, examples are your heart rate, control of your heart rate, making it go faster or slower. Peristalsis, which is the process of swallowing food and pushing that food all the way to the end of your digestive tract. And also sweating. Sweating is also controlled by your autonomic nervous system. Just a little bit more information on the autonomic nervous system. It will involve your smooth and your cardiac muscles, as well as all your internal organs and your glands. These actions will be controlled in the medulla and the hypothalamus regions of the brain. And most activities in our autonomic nervous system is integrated locally within the spinal cord or the brain. So, berdasarkan ayat yang ketiga ini, kamu boleh bayangkan setiap fungsi atau setiap function, setiap proses yang dikawal oleh autonomic nervous system, ada kawasan dia di dalam otak ataupun di dalam akar tunjang yang akan mengawal proses tersebut. So there'll be a region, a locality inside of your brain that is specific for controlling breathing. There's a region in your brain that is specific for controlling the sweating, how much sweat you do. There's a region in your brain that controls how much pee you make. So that is talking about the third point here. Your autonomic nervous system also composes of two types of motor neurons. So ada 3 jenis neuron, dan dalam 3 jenis neuron itu ada motor neuron. Motor neuron pula boleh dibahagi kepada 2 jenis lagi, iaitu preganglionic neuron, which is neuron that comes out from the central nervous system. And we also have postganglionic neuron, which is neuron that goes towards the effectors. So, kadang-kadang motor neuron itu terus daripada central nervous system terus pergi kepada dia punya otot. Tapi dalam case autonomic nervous system, ada juga motor neuron berjumpa motor neuron kedua, barulah pergi kepada effector organs. Once again, these are extra information. You don't have to memorize this, but if you know, you know. And last but not least, before we get back to the main points in this lesson, here are extra information on the autonomic nervous system. You can see here what is controlled by the parasympathetic division and what is controlled by the sympathetic division. With the new syllabus, a lot of things are trimmed down, so you don't have to memorize these things anymore, but we just keep them here so you have the chance to learn in case it's useful for you in the future. Now that all that is said and done, let's go back to the main points of this lesson. Let's learn more about the neurons. The neuron is a specialized cell that is responsible in transmitting nerve impulse. It's also called a nerve cell, and there are 3 types of neurons, and it has its specific function. The first type of neuron is sensory or afferent neuron. The function of sensory neuron is to transmit impulse from receptor to the central nervous system. The second type of neuron is interneuron. Their function is to convey nerve impulses between various parts of the central nervous system. And the third type of neuron is motors or efferent neurons, which transmit impulse from the central nervous system to the effector. So these are diagrams showing what a motor neuron would look like, what a sensory neuron would look like, and what an interneuron would look like. There are many different variations of this diagram, so don't be surprised if you see drawings of neurons that are a little bit different from what we have here. Let's talk about the structure of a neuron a little bit more. A neuron will consist of dendrites, which will receive nerve impulse from the neighboring neurons, and a cell body, which consists of the nucleus, cytoplasm, and other organelles of the neuron. So if you have a blank piece of paper, let's try drawing that neuron once again. So here we have the cell body with the nucleus. We also have these dendrites coming off of one side of the cell body. Another structure in the neuron is the axon or nerve fiber. So this is an extension of the cytoplasm of the neuron. Some are covered by myelin sheath. They will be branched at the end into many swollen axon terminals called the synaptic knob. So if you want to draw the axon, you can draw it like this. And if you want to, you can draw little round bits at the end to show that it becomes swollen to form synaptic knobs. And also here we have the myelin sheath as drawn in purple. The myelin sheath is actually not part of the neuron itself. Like the neuron didn't make the myelin sheath. Another cell called the Schwann cell makes the myelin sheath, but we usually just associate it as part of the neuron. So selalu kita anggap dia sebagai sebahagian daripada neuron sahaja, walaupun myelin sheath ini dihasilkan oleh sel Schwann cell. Okay, and last but not least, we also have this structure in the neuron called the nodes of Ranvier. So if you're looking at your axon, okay, you see these parts that are not covered by the myelin sheath. This unmyelinated region between two myelin sheaths is called as the nodes of Ranvier. Also, when you're writing things down, make sure you take note that you spell Ranvier with a capital R because that is a scientist name. So yes, that is the main points when you learn about the structures of neurons. You need to know the dendrites, cell body, axons, and the nodes of Ranvier. In here, we have a diagram taken from a book that shows you the structure of the neuron. And you can see here the dendrites, cell bodies, axons, nodes of Ranvier, axon terminals, Schwann cells, myelin sheaths, and the nucleus. We also have another extra information. So you may have heard this word before, glia or neuroglia. Neuroglia or glia is any of several types of cell that function primarily to support neurons. The neuroglia will exchange substances with the extracellular fluid and in this way exert control on the neuronal environment. So kalau kamu bayangkan neuron-neuron dalam otak dan akar tunjang kita tuh, dia banyak fokus kepada melakukan kerja. Yang menjaga neuron sambil dia buat kerja adalah sel-sel yang digelar sebagai neuroglia. There are many types of neuroglia or glia cells, and in this diagram alone, there is 3 types of neuroglia, and there may be more as you learn and as you discover new types of cells. So dialah penjaga, dialah suri rumah, dialah pembantu menyokong neuron dalam badan. So let's start learning about the resting and action potential in neurons. We'll start by talking about what is a membrane potential. Almost all plasma membranes will have an electrical potential across them, with the inside usually negative with respect to the outside. So dalam lebih negatif berbanding dengan di luar. The membrane potential, this difference in charge, will have 2 basic functions. First, it allows a cell to function as a battery. This membrane potential provides power to operate a variety of molecular devices embedded in the membrane. And the second function is in electrically excitable cells, such as neurons and muscle cells. It is used for transmitting signals between different parts of a cell. So, perbezaan di antara dalam dengan luar sel ini boleh digunakan sebagai tenaga, nomor 1, dan kedua untuk activate neuron dengan muscle untuk menyampaikan signal. So here's a diagram about membrane potential and kind of the concept of it. So you imagine you take 2 electrodes and you place one on the outside of the cell and another one on the inside of the plasma membrane of a living cell. You will measure an electrical potential difference or voltage between the 2 electrodes. This electrical potential difference is what we call as the membrane potential. The importance of membrane potential. From a physiological standpoint, membrane potential is responsible for sending messages by transmitting impulse to and from the central nervous system. Impulse transmission can only begin when the cell membrane is in resting potential. Maksud slide ini adalah disebabkan ada membrane potential, dengan itulah kita punya neuron boleh sampaikan maklumat dari central nervous system kepada tempat-tempat lain. And this impulse transmission, this message can only send when the cell membrane is in resting potential. So kita mesti start dengan tiada apa-apa, baru kita boleh start menyampaikan message. Just like how when you want to do homework, your brain has to be free of distractions. You have to be kind of ready before you can start doing homework and doing some thinking. So here's a point we should remember. Membrane potential is created due to the presence of various transmembrane proteins on the plasma membrane that allows the movement of different ions. Disebabkan ada transmembrane protein pada membrane, barulah ada pergerakan ion, barulah kita akan ada membrane potential. So let's learn more about these transmembrane protein. Down here we have an example of a nondescript transmembrane protein. So ini tidak spesifik kepada mana-mana jenis. Well, when we talk about the transmembrane protein, we're talking about the ones on the axon in the neurons, okay? So the axon membrane will consist of several transmembrane proteins, and each transmembrane protein is specific for selected ions. Kalau protein itu adalah untuk membenarkan sodium ion untuk lalu, dia memang untuk sodium ion saja, dia tidak akan benarkan ion-ion lain untuk lalu. And some of them need ATP to work, and some just start working when there is nerve impulse in the region. Ada yang mesti ada ATP baru dia boleh buka. Ada yang dia akan tunggu ada nerve impulse baru dia akan buka dia punya ion channels. So let's learn about what is this nerve impulse. Nerve impulse, or action potential, is a short-lasting event in which the electrical membrane potential of a cell rapidly rises and falls, following a consistent trajectory. It is due to different ions crossing the neuron membrane. So ini kita dapat maksud atau penjelasan kepada nerve impulse. Nerve impulse adalah sesuatu yang berlaku dalam masa yang sangat singkat. Okay, short-lasting event. The membrane potential will rapidly rise and fall. Okay, membrane potential tu akan dengan cepatnya melonjak naik, turun, and then pelan-pelan back to normal. Dia sentiasa ikut ini pattern atau ini trajectory yang tetap. Dia tidak akan tiba-tiba terlebih tinggi atau terlebih rendah ataupun banyak alunan. Okay, it always follows a consistent trajectory. This nerve impulse is because ions will be crossing the neuron membrane. There are three types of transmembrane protein, or three main types that we focus on the axon membrane. The first is non-gated channel. The second is voltage-gated channels or gated ion channels. Dua nama menunjuk kepada benda yang sama. And we also have sodium-potassium pumps. For non-gated channels, these are channels that allow sodium and potassium to pass through. They allow ions to flow down the concentration gradients. So ini kira sebagai passive transport. The second type, the voltage-gated channels, examples of them are voltage-gated potassium channels and voltage-gated sodium channels. These will allow ions to flow down the concentration gradient, and they work in the presence of nerve impulse only. So ini juga passive transport, tapi ion channel dia hanya akan buka bila ada nerve impulse. And lastly, number 3, sodium-potassium pumps will spend energy in the form of ATP to pump 3 sodium ions out of the cell and then pump in 2 potassium ions into the cell. Ini yang akan buat active transport yang menggunakan tenaga dalam bentuk ATP. This sodium-potassium pump is also the same thing that you've learned in the previous semester and perhaps even in middle school before you came into metrics. These three types of transmembrane proteins can occur simultaneously with the diffusion of sodium and ions through non-gated sodium and non-gated potassium ion channels. Now here is a diagram showing the transmembrane proteins and the environment inside and outside of the cell. So if we look at the concentrations of sodium ions and potassium ions, there is a greater concentration of potassium ion inside the cell. As for sodium ions, there is greater concentration of sodium ions outside of the cell. This concentration gradient is created by the sodium-potassium pump, whereas the sodium channel and the potassium channels, when they are non-gated, they are always open and they allow the ions to pass through based on the concentration gradient. Okay, so ini tunjukkan posisi setiap transmembrane protein. Begitu saja. Now that you know what is a membrane potential and the three types of transmembrane proteins that are involved, let's talk about the types of membrane potential that we will learn. The first is resting potential and the second is action potential. Let's look at them one by one. Let's begin with resting potential. So what is resting potential? It is the membrane potential of an axon when it is not transmitting any impulse, and it's measured to be negative 70 millivolts. The inside of the axon is more negatively charged as compared to the outside of the axon. How is this resting potential created? Well, it is mainly due to the sodium-potassium pump. The cytoplasm of the axon will contain mostly potassium ions, but lower concentration of sodium ions. So you can make a remark there, and as you can see in the diagram, higher concentration of potassium ions, lower concentration of sodium ions inside of cytoplasm of axon. However, due to the high permeability of axon's membrane towards potassium ions, there is a net movement of potassium ions out of the axon. Maksud ayat kedua ini disebabkan membrane axon ini mudah untuk potassium ion keluar, high permeability. Then there is net movement of potassium ion out of the axon, means banyak net movement dia akan tunjukkan potassium ion ini akan keluar daripada sel. Firstly, more sodium ions is being removed out of the axon by sodium-potassium pump. As you know, sodium-potassium pump is active transport. It's going to force a lot of sodium ions out. And secondly, the net movement of potassium ions out of the axon further exacerbates the loss of cations from the cytoplasm of the axon. So dalam arti kata lain, pergerakan keluar potassium ion, pergerakan keluar sodium ion melalui sodium-potassium pump menyebabkan kita punya membrane potential menjadi negatif sebab yang positif terkeluar. This causes the cytoplasm of the axon to be relatively negatively charged as compared to the outside of the axon. There's also another smaller factor in that there is a relatively negative charge contributed by the negatively charged large proteins that are trapped inside axons and are unable to cross the axon membrane due to its size. So kebanyakan the bigger reason, okay, sebab yang lebih besar kenapa membrane potential ini negatif adalah disebabkan pergerakan potassium ion dan sodium ion. Sebab kecil kenapa membrane potential ini negatif adalah disebabkan oleh protein-protein yang besar dalam cytoplasm yang ada negative charge. But that is a smaller factor compared to the movement of ions. So we don't usually focus on this point. We usually focus on the ion-ion points. So just a quick summary on how resting potential is created. Just to recap, it's because of the transmembrane proteins. Sodium-potassium pump is going to make sure that there is high concentration of potassium that is inside of the cell and lower concentration of sodium inside of the cell. So sodium is being pumped out. And secondly, the high permeability of the axon's plasma membrane allows the high concentration of potassium ions inside of the cytoplasm to passively exit through the potassium channels. So, K pun keluar, Na plus pun keluar. Ini menyebabkan kita punya membrane dapat reading yang negative. And that's how we get negative 70 millivolts resting potential. Okay, so that's it for resting potential. Let's have a look at action potential. So this is the second type of membrane potential that you learned about. Action potential is the membrane potential of an axon when it is transmitting an impulse. Dalam erti kata lain, ini adalah membrane potential bila kita punya neuron sedang membuat kerja. At this point, the inside of the axon is more positively charged as compared to the outside of the axon. In this diagram down here, you will see it shows the sequential movement of action potential or flipping of the charge occurring along the axon. So dia bukan keseluruhan plasma membrane itu sekaligus menjadi positif, dia macam ikut kawasan. So daripada permulaan sini, mula-mula satu bahagian sahaja yang cytoplasm dia positively charged, dan diikuti dengan segmen seterusnya. So it'll move in a certain direction. When we talk about the pathway of impulse transmission, you'll learn that impulse is transmitted along different parts of the neuron. So impulse can be transmitted along the axon of the neuron. It can be transmitted across a synapse. So yang B itu adalah daripada neuron pertama kepada neuron kedua. And the third pathway of impulse transmission, which is C, is at neuromuscular junction. So yang kita belajar dalam 10.1 ini adalah pathway A, impulse transmission along the axon. So let's look at that. This impulse transmission along the axon will occur in a series of events. It begins with a resting potential, where the membrane is in standby mode to receive an electrical change. And to understand the process, we should remember the sequence of events that take place localized in axon before inducing the neighboring region. Apa maksud 3 ayat ini setakat ini? Well, first sentence, impulse transmission, ada dia punya fasa-fasa, ada dia punya siri. Satu demi satu peristiwa dia berlaku. Poin kedua, dia memang bermula dengan resting potential yang negative 70 millivolts tadi tu. Okay, bila dia negative 70 millivolts, walaupun dia tidak membuat apa-apa, dia actually ready menunggu menerima maklumat. Dan poin ketiga, to understand process, we should remember sequence of events. You should know that when impulse transmission occurs, dia akan berlaku di sesuatu kawasan pertama dulu. Selesai di kawasan pertama impulse transmission, baru kawasan kedua akan ada impulse transmission. Kawasan kedua selesai, baru pergi kawasan ketiga dan sebelahnya dan sebelahnya dan sebelahnya. The third point is saying dia akan pergi kawasan kecil demi kawasan kecil. And then impulse transmission along the axon will occur in these 5 events, this series of 5 events. So 5 peristiwa ini yang kita akan tengok satu demi satu. First one is resting phase. Second one is depolarization. Third one is a rising phase of action potential. Fourth one is falling phase of action potential. And fifth one is undershoot. And this is showing a diagram showing how impulse transmission along the axon will occur. So we start with the resting potential. So mula-mula kita punya perbezaan concentration of ion memang begini. Bila kita mula ada action potential, okay, so something happening, some message being transmitted along the axon, we're gonna have depolarization. You're gonna see the ions are gonna go to different places. Mula-mula sodium dulu masuk, kemudian potassium keluar. Lepas tu, dia akan balik kepada resting potential. Take your time. You might want to come back to this diagram again after we go through the steps just to better understand and reflect on your learning. Okay, and the impulse transmission along the axon is also usually shown in this graph that plots the membrane potential of the cell with time. So kalau kita cucuk electrode itu, kita tunggu ada nerve ataupun impulse transmission berlaku, kita akan nampak pada meter itu akan berlaku benda macam ini. Okay, so they will be starting with resting potential, then something happens, then it goes back to normal, which is resting potential. We'll start with the first phase of impulse transmission. Tadi saya cakap ada 5 fasa, jadi sekarang kita tengok fasa dia satu demi satu. The first phase is resting potential or polarization stage. This is the stage that in the absence of stimulus, the neuron membrane is polarized. Polarized maksudnya ada bahagian yang positif, ada bahagian yang negative charge. At this stage, there is difference in electrical charge between the outside, which is the interstitial fluid, and the inside or exoplasm of the axon. The inside of the axon cytoplasm is more negative due to high amount of anions compared to the outside. And this is what we discussed in the previous slides. Then we go on to the second stage or second phase. The second event is depolarization. When the stimulus arrives, some of the voltage-gated sodium channels are opened. So ini adalah stimulus daripada sama ada neuron sebelum ini ataupun bahagian sel sebelum ini. Okay, so akan ada stimulus dan sesetengah daripada kita punya transmembrane protein akan terbuka. Some of the voltage-gated sodium channels will open. And the permeability of the axon membrane towards sodium ions will increase. Kalau voltage-gated sodium channel buka, maksudnya lebih banyak peluang dan lebih mudah untuk sodium ion Na+ masuk ke dalam sel. So Na+ will diffuse into the axon down its concentration gradient. The inside of the axon will become more positive and the axon membrane will depolarize. Kalau kita nampak depolarization, maksudnya dia akan terbalik. Kalau tadi negatif di dalam, positif di luar, semasa depolarization, dia akan macam berubah supaya dalam lebih positif, luar lebih negatif. So when the depolarization reaches negative 55 millivolts for a mammalian neuron, a neuron will fire an action potential, or what is called as a nerve impulse, and this is the threshold. So if the stimulus is strong enough, it will make more voltage-gated sodium channels open, and that means more sodium ions coming in, strong depolarization. It will change the membrane potential of the cell. So bila membrane potential itu naik daripada negative 70, mungkin dia akan naik kepada negative 60, then negative 65, and eventually negative 55 millivolts. Bila dia sampai sejak negative 55 millivolts, it will trigger the next stage in this impulse transmission. Okay, that negative 55 millivolts is considered the threshold ataupun macam kita boleh cakap syarat minimum untuk kita punya neuron anggap stimuli itu sebagai benda yang serius. Kalau dia sampai ini threshold, then dia akan proceed next stage. Kalau dia tidak sampai ini threshold, dia akan turun balik kepada negative 70 millivolts. If your neuron does not reach the critical threshold level of negative 55 millivolts for mammalian neurons, then no action potential will be formed. So we don't go into stage number 3. So this is what we know as an all or none event, an all or nothing event. Sama ada we go until stage 3 ataupun we stop here. Then let's talk about what happens if the neuron can reach stage 3, the rising potential of action potential. This is also called the stage for further depolarization. Once the threshold level is crossed, a positive feedback will occur inside of the neuron. More voltage-gated sodium channels will be opened and more sodium ions will diffuse into the exoplasm. It will cause further depolarization of the axon membrane. This situation will trigger the rising of action potential. So, bila dia sampai sejak ini threshold, semakin banyak itu voltage-gated sodium channel akan buka, semakin banyak sodium ion akan masuk ke dalam sel, dan kita punya sel punya membrane potential menjadi semakin positif. And this triggers rising of action potential, and the internal environment of the neuron becomes positively charged rather than compared to the outside of the cell. And during this phase, the voltage-gated potassium channels still remain closed. Semasa fasa ketiga ini, this third stage, third phase, only voltage-gated sodium channels open and voltage-gated potassium channels still close. It was only in the fourth stage where we have the falling phase of action potential or repolarization that we see a difference. Okay, so when the membrane potential reaches positive 35 millivolts for mammalian neurons, the voltage-gated sodium channels become inactive. So dia sampai saja positive 35 millivolts, yang sodium tadi, yang Na plus punya channel akan tutup, dia berhenti berfungsi. And it will block the influx of sodium ions into the exoplasm. So sodium ion tidak boleh masuk balik sudah. Meanwhile, when we reach this stage, barulah voltage-gated potassium channels are opened, causing rapid outflow of potassium ions. So, mula-mula banyak potassium ion di dalam membrane. Sekali bila sampai kepada fasa ini, voltage-gated potassium channel akan terbuka dan potassium ion dari dalam membrane akan keluar kepada interstitial fluid. So the fast flow of potassium ions causes the axon membrane potential to decrease. And this will be at the peak of the graph. Talking more about the stage number 4, both these events will quickly bring the membrane potential back to negative charge. So dari tadi dia 35 millivolts. Sodium ions tidak boleh masuk sudah. Potassium ions keluar dengan cepat daripada membrane. And that makes us go back to negative. The concentration of potassium ions will be higher in interstitial fluid and concentration of sodium ions will be higher in the exoplasm. This means that the neuron membrane has undergone repolarization. That means the inside of the axon becomes more negative than the outside of the axon again. This stage is also called as the falling phase. The fifth stage after that is undershoot and hyperpolarization. Ini dia macam terlebih, dia terturun sekejap, terkurang daripada negative 70. This is because of the slow closure of the voltage-gated potassium ion channels that causes the overflow of potassium ions out of the axon. Sepatutnya bila cukup sudah negative 70, dia tutupkan. Tapi disebabkan voltage-gated ion channel ni lambat sedikit mau respond, lebih banyak potassium ion akan terkeluar daripada axon. So, we become a little bit too negative. So, it causes the axon membrane charge to become more negative. And as the voltage-gated potassium channels close, the sodium-potassium pump and the non-gated ion channels will bring the membrane potential of the axon back to resting potential again. So sekarang dia terlebih negatif, tapi jangan lupa kita masih ada kita punya sodium-potassium pump dan ion channel yang biasa yang tidak perlukan apa-apa active transport. Mereka akan memastikan membrane potential axon balik kepada resting potential. So what I talked about earlier, you can also see in this graph here. In your worksheet, you will need to draw your graph again and pay attention to where it rises, where is the maximum of the action potential, where does it go down, and how do you label it as the first stage, second stage, third, fourth, or fifth stage. Okay, and then last akan kembali kepada stage number 1. If you have any confusions, you're not clear about any parts of this lesson, please feel free to ask. Okay, so that is it for how we create action potential. So just as a recall, okay, just to refresh what you know, this is the propagation of nerve impulse along an axon. Nerve impulse will be transmitted in one direction, so from here, from the cell body towards the synaptic terminals. We start by ion channels in the axon that are voltage gated. They will depolarize. Depolarization at one of the axon segments will trigger the opening of ion channels in the next segment, and consequently, the action potential spreads along the axon as a wave of depolarization. So, slide dan ayat-ayat ini adalah untuk mengingatkan kamu bahawa nerve impulse, dia bukan satu sel berlaku serentak, dia adalah segmen demi segmen, demi segmen, demi segmen, demi segmen, demi segmen, demi segmen, sampailah dia sampai di hujung di synaptic terminal. Action potential is transmitted by regenerating itself along axon in one direction. So action potential menjana action potential yang seterusnya dalam satu arah. Depolarization occur as adequate sodium ions flow inward across the membrane at one location. Depolarization berlaku bila ada sodium ion yang masuk dan bilangan sodium ion yang masuk itu mestilah cukup. That's what adequate means, secukupnya in one location, di itu kawasan. An action potential is generated when depolarization takes place. So it's when the flipping of the charge happens, depolarization, baru kita akan ada action potential. Depolarization spreads to neighboring regions and then it causes the rising of action potentials there. Behind the traveling zone of depolarization is a zone of repolarization as potassium ions flows outward. Okay, so ini masuk kepada fasa yang kedua. Di belakang ini masuk ke dalam fasa yang ketiga misalnya. Okay, and then this depolarization, repolarization process is repeated in the next region of the membrane. So satu demi satu, dia orang ikut giliran. The inward current cannot produce another action potential behind it. This prevents impulse from being transmitted backwards. So kalau kamu nampak di sini, dia ada dua arah kan? Okay, for the repolarization, it will occur towards the front and towards the back, but the one towards the back will have no effect, only towards the front. And that brings us to talking about the characteristics of the nerve impulse. So mari kita cakap pasal ciri-ciri nerve impulse. There are three main characteristics when we talk about the impulse. So the impulse, first of all, is a simulation. Dia adalah satu stimulus, okay? And secondly, an impulse is an all or none event. Sama ada dia ada ataupun tiada. Impulse is triggered only if the depolarization is above the threshold level. Once the action potential is achieved, there is stronger intensity of a stimulus will not increase the size of action potential. Kalau ada action potential, memang itu sahajalah size dia. Dia tidak akan terlebih kuat ataupun terkurang. Sama ada dia ada potential ataupun tiada action potential. Third characteristic of impulse is that impulses have a refractory period. Refractory period macam ada dia perlukan masa untuk dia sendiri pulih. Refractory period is a period when the neuron is not sensitive to depolarization. It refers to a recovery phase of the previous active region. So kalau kawasan itu baru saja dapat menghasilkan action potential, dia perlukan masa untuk rehat sebelum dia dapat hasilkan action potential yang seterusnya. So there are two types of refractory period. The first type is absolute refractory period. The second type is a relative refractory period. These refractory periods control the direction in which the impulse travels. Impulse will travel one way along the axon from the excitable region to the resting region next to it. Oh, sorry, there is actually more than three characteristics for impulse. The fourth characteristic for impulse is that the speed of conduction of impulse depends on a few factors. So, apakah faktor yang akan mempengaruhi berapa cepat sel-sel otak kita dapat menyampaikan maklumat? Well, the first factor is the diameter of the axon. Besarkah axon sel otak kita? Impulse will travel faster or become transmitted faster in a large diameter axon because a larger diameter of axon will have less resistance to the flow of charges. It will contain more gated channels to allow more sodium ions to flow into the cell. So lebih cepat ion itu dapat masuk, lebih cepat action potential dapat dijana, dan lebih cepat kita punya sel-sel otak dapat sampaikan maklumat kepada neuron seterusnya. The second factor that affects speed of impulse transmission is presence of myelin sheath. Impulse transmission will be faster in an axon with myelin sheath, which is what we call a myelinated axon. Myelin is an insulator. It insulates the axon from depolarizers and causes saltatory conduction. So, saya sudah pernah cakap, myelin ini adalah penebat. Dia akan menyebabkan saltatory conduction. So, this means it will only have depolarization occur at the nodes of Ranvier. What this means is that this event will generate action potentials at nodes of Ranvier and make the saltatory spread. action potential will jump from one node to another and cause the transmission to occur faster. So for this point, talking about myelin sheath, let's have a look at this diagram. Really sorry why it came out so dark. But this is showing how it looks in a myelinated axon. So kalau itu axon tiada myelin, dia akan pelan-pelan satu bahagian demi satu bahagian demi satu bahagian demi satu bahagian demi satu bahagian. Dia macam kamu naik tangga satu demi satu step. Tapi kalau kita ada myelin, okay, if you have myelin on your axon, you have these nodes of Ranvier, you will have this saltatory conduction where it's like, okay, we have action potential here, and then it will skip the myelin, it will go to the next node of Ranvier, and then go to the next node of Ranvier. Senang cakap, kalau tiada myelin, dia macam kamu naik tangga satu langkah demi satu langkah. Tapi kalau ada myelin, ada saltatory conduction, macam satu kali kamu langkah, kamu pijak 2-3 step. Okay, so kamu macam ambil langkah yang lebih besar masa naik tangga. That is what saltatory conduction along myelinated axon is. Okay, so this is another diagram showing that this is with saltatory spread. Down here is slow spread in an unmyelinated axon. Okay, so that is it for talking about impulse transmission along the axon. Daripada tadi sampai sekarang kita cakap pasal action potential, membrane potential, apa yang berlaku pada axon. So lepas kita belajar benda-benda axon, impulse sekarang sudah sampai di hujung. Untuk dia pergi dari neuron pertama kepada neuron kedua, kita akan beralih kepada topik seterusnya. It brings us to the next topic of synapse and synaptic transmission. So this is a synapse. This is when your first neuron meets your second neuron. This is a simplified version of the diagrams that we usually see. You can take a look at it. We have the blue one as the presynaptic neuron ataupun neuron pertama. And in this diagram, the green one is the postsynaptic neuron or the second neuron. Okay, sini dalam presynaptic neuron ni kamu boleh tengok ada neurotransmitter, ada synaptic vesicle, ada mitochondria. Dan dalam postsynaptic neuron, ada yang kuning ini adalah ligand-gated ion channel. We'll learn more about them as we learn the structure of the synapse and also how impulse is transmitted. So let's learn a bit more about synapses. Synapse is the point at which the nerve impulse passes from one neuron to another. Synapses allow for chemical communication between neurons and other cells through the use of neurotransmitters. And synapses are junctional complexes between presynaptic membranes and postsynaptic membranes. So they are the receptor surfaces of recipient neurons or effectors. When we talk about the structure of synapses, we will see a presynaptic terminal or presynaptic knob, as well as a postsynaptic membrane or postsynaptic knob. The presynaptic terminal will be from the first neuron. It will have a large number of mitochondria. It will have synaptic vesicles containing neurotransmitters. And examples of neurotransmitters that I can give you are acetylcholine, noradrenaline, and dopamine. So you may have heard the names of some of these molecules before. These are your neurotransmitters. The membrane at the presynaptic knob is called as the presynaptic membrane. Let's talk about the postsynaptic knob next. So this is belonging to neuron number 2. The postsynaptic knob will have ligand-gated ion channels, which contains receptors or the binding sites of neurotransmitters. So kamu tahu ion channel adalah transmembrane protein yang membenarkan ion untuk keluar masuk. Ligand-gated ion channels means these are ion channels that will open when a neurotransmitter binds to this ligand-gated ion channel. Dia adalah ion channel, pintu yang akan buka bila ada ligand ataupun neurotransmitter yang melekat pada dia. Kalau tiada ligand, ion channel ini akan tertutup. Ada ligand melekat, ion channel ini akan terbuka dan kita boleh hasilkan action potential. So this is another diagram showing what it looks like at a synapse. So this is the kind of diagram that you usually see, and it has more details. Do use diagrams like this when you're learning more about the synapse. And just a very quick overview of the impulse transmission along the axon to synapse. So daripada sebelum ni kita belajar pasal impulse transmission from axon. So bila daripada cell body itu, so the stimulus arrives at the cell body, it generates action potential from the dendrites to the cell body to the axon, down here. Sorry, I'll bring my head, come with you. Okay, so we start here, stimulus arrives, we generate an action potential from the dendrites to the cell body and from the cell body to the axon, and we go down as impulse is transmitted along the axons until we finally reach the synapse. When we reach the synapse, this impulse will be transmitted firstly by electric, then it will make these things go out. These things are neurotransmitters, and once they go out, there will be chemical transmission, and then the chemical stuff will reach the ligand-gated ion channels, and that will make a stimulus on the postsynaptic membrane. Okay, so that's just a very quick overview. Ini adalah arah dia. Okay, this is how it flows. And we'll look at the impulse transmission across synapse in better detail in the next parts. Do take a break if you need it, but if you're ready, let's learn about impulse transmission across the synapse. So bila itu impulse sampai di synapse, ini adalah langkah-langkah yang diambil untuk sampaikan message kepada neuron yang kedua. The action potential will arrive at the presynaptic knob and it will depolarize the presynaptic membrane. The membrane becomes permeable to calcium ions. So, maksud di sini action potential sampai menyebabkan presynaptic membrane depolarize. Sekarang membrane becomes permeable to calcium ion. Mudah untuk calcium ion masuk ke dalam presynaptic membrane. Voltage-gated calcium channels at presynaptic membrane are opened and they allow the influx of calcium ions. Sekarang calcium ions boleh masuk sebab pintu dia, iaitu voltage-gated calcium channels, sudah buka. When you have lots of these calcium ions coming in, the calcium ions in the presynaptic knob will trigger the fusion of synaptic vesicles to the presynaptic membrane, and thus the neurotransmitters are released into the synaptic cleft by exocytosis. So, calcium ion tadi itu akan menyebabkan vesikel-vesikel yang mengandungi neurotransmitter untuk keluarkan neurotransmitter dia kepada synaptic cleft. Proses ini digelar sebagai exocytosis. Bila neurotransmitter itu sudah keluar, dia akan spread, dia akan diffuse. The neurotransmitter will diffuse across the synaptic cleft. And then the neurotransmitters will bind to the receptors on ligand-gated ion channels at the postsynaptic membrane and thus open the channels for sodium ions. So, bila itu neurotransmitter sampai di seberang, dia akan membuka ligand-gated ion channel dan itu akan menyebabkan sodium ion masuk di dalam postsynaptic membrane. Apa yang saya cakap dari tadi, kalau kamu tengok dalam diagram ini, that was action potential come here, calcium ions come in, causes synaptic vesicle to exocytosis, so semua neurotransmitter sekarang terkeluar di bahagian ini, synaptic cleft. Dan bila sampai di synaptic cleft, itu neurotransmitter melekat kepada ligand-gated ion channels. So tengok di sini, dia melekat kepada ligand-gated ion channel. Terus itu ligand-gated ion channel membenarkan ion untuk masuk. This one, the ligand-gated ion channels on the postsynaptic membrane will allow sodium ions to come in. So now sodium ions enter the postsynaptic knob and depolarize the postsynaptic membrane. Action potential will arise at the postsynaptic knob. The sodium ion channels will close when the neurotransmitters detach from receptors. So bila ini neurotransmitter selesai buat kerja ataupun dia kena bawa pergi tempat lain, okay, it will detach and the ion channels will close. Neurotransmitters are immediately degraded by enzymes in the synaptic cleft. So dia terus dicerna oleh enzim yang ada di sana. And some will be taken up by the presynaptic knob and recycled. So dia bergantung kepada neuron tersebut. Kebanyakan masanya dia akan dihapuskan. Neurotransmitter itu dihapuskan. Sesetengah daripada itu neurotransmitter akan diserap semula, disimpan dalam presynaptic knob untuk digunakan semula. So those are the processes that are involved in the transmission of impulse across a synapse. So just to very quickly summarize, it sounds very simple when I go through it several times, but for the first time that you hear it, it might be very confusing. So take your time to read through this and digest. Feel free to ask questions or use other resources if you find that there are videos on the internet that help you understand this better. Tapi sebelum kamu pergi kepada sumber-sumber lain, saya mau re-explain saja dulu once again. This is a very quick summary of the impulse transmission across a synapse. We start with action potential reaching here. And then we have depolarization. Calcium ions come in. Synaptic vesicle that contains neurotransmitter fused with membrane, so ada exocytosis. And all the neurotransmitters is now in the synaptic cleft. Synaptic cleft adalah jurang di antara presynaptic knob dengan postsynaptic knob. So ruang di sini, longkang dito. Gaung di antara dia. Now we have the neurotransmitters in the synaptic cleft. They will eventually bind to the ligand-gated ion channels. Ligand-gated ion channels will open. Sodium ions come in. And now we have action potential happening in the postsynaptic membrane. So that is how impulse is transmitted across the synapse, even though neuron number 1 and neuron number 2 is not directly touching. Tujuan synapse ini untuk sampaikan maklumat, walaupun itu neuron tidak dapat berpegang tangan. That's pretty much it. So I hope that's clear. You can also compare impulse transmission at the synapse and along the axon. So kalau kamu mau buat perbandingan, boleh coba buat perbandingan sendiri. And that is talking about how impulse is transmitted. And those are under normal conditions. In the next part, we'll be talking about if you take drugs, how will that affect your nervous system? So this next bit is talking about the action of drugs on your nervous system. So you already know that generally taking drugs is a bit bad unless it's a prescribed medicine where the people who give you the medicine kind of have a better idea of how it will help your condition. But generally, don't take random drugs because it can affect your neurotransmitters and affect how your brain works. In this lesson, we will be focusing on one type of drug, which is cocaine. So let's look at the mechanism of drug action on your synapse. In the normal neural communication process, dopamine is released by a neuron into the synapse where it can bind to dopamine receptors at postsynaptic membrane on neighboring neurons. So ini adalah normal condition. Okay, dalam situasi yang normal, okay, tanpa apa-apa dada, sesetengah neuron kamu akan gunakan dopamine sebagai neurotransmitter. And normally, dopamine is then recycled back to the presynaptic knob by a specialized protein called the dopamine transporter. So, maksud ayat kedua ni, biasanya, lepas digunakan dalam satu kali impulse transmission, dopamine akan disimpan, dia kena recycle balik. Dengan bantuan ini protein yang digelar sebagai dopamine transporter. Tukang bawa dopamine. But what if you take drugs? If you take drugs, for example, cocaine, when cocaine is present, it will attach to the dopamine transporter and block the normal recycling process. So, kalau ada cocaine, dopamine transporter, tukang angkat dopamine ini akan sibuk layan cocaine dia tidak dapat angkut dopamine untuk recycle semula. As a result, the dopamine build-up will occur in the synaptic cleft and it will bind to its receptor at the postsynaptic membrane. Kalau tukang recycle itu tidak datang untuk ambil dopamine, sekarang kita ada berlebihan dopamine dalam synaptic cleft. Berlebihan dopamine means ada itu dopamine yang akan melekat balik kepada ligand-gated ion channel di postsynaptic membrane, walaupun actually tiada maklumat daripada neuron nombor 1. Dia macam bagi fake message. That means depolarization will occur continuously and causing a long-lasting impulse transmission. So, selagi dopamine itu ada dalam synaptic cleft, dia akan terus activate neuron yang kedua itu. Dia balik-balik buat depolarization, balik-balik ada impulse transmission. And this is what gives the user a feeling of euphoria or an energetic feeling until the cocaine is naturally removed from the system. So selagi dadah cocaine itu ada dalam badan, dopamine transporter sibuk, di kawasan synaptic cleft, di synapse akan ada berlebihan dopamine. Berlebihan dopamine, kita punya neuron kedua akan terlebih terangsang. Bila neuron terlebih terangsang, itulah kita ada halusinasi. Itulah kita ada perasaan euforia ataupun semua perasaan-perasaan yang menggairahkan yang biasa orang ada bila diorang ambil dadah. Okay. And this continues until the drugs are gone, basically. And then the neuron will respond to this continual stimulation by reducing the number of dopamine receptors in the postsynaptic membrane. So kalau banyak kali ambil dadah, maybe the first time not much effect, but if this happens several times, if this incident repeats, your body will think, kita ni overreact. We are overreacting to too much dopamine. So that we don't overreact, we don't need to have so many dopamine receptors. Your body will reduce how many dopamine receptors it has in the postsynaptic membrane so that it doesn't get these fake messages. Okay, it don't want fake messages. It want useful message only. But the problem is when your body reduced the number of dopamine receptors in postsynaptic membrane, the drug user will become more addicted. Dia masih mau kejar itu perasaan high, itu perasaan gairah. Jadi untuk dapat perasaan euforia, perasaan high itu lagi, pengguna dadah perlu guna lebih banyak dadah, baru dia boleh dapat perasaan itu semula. Sebab sekarang kurang reseptor. So what you need? You need more dopamine, more cocaine, in order to feel the same high. Thus, more drug is needed for the addict to experience the pleasurable effects. And that is very briefly what the effect of cocaine is on some of your neurons. So dadah yang berbeza, dia akan ada efek yang berbeza kepada neuron yang berbeza, dia akan mempengaruhi neurotransmitter yang berbeza. Tapi ini adalah salah satu contoh kita. So once again, to refresh, when we talk about the effect of cocaine on your system, we're talking about how cocaine will disturb these dopamine transporters. Okay, the green one over here, it will disturb the dopamine transporter. So you have too much dopamine out down here that makes the second neuron or the postsynaptic knob become overly stimulated. Okay, so that is it for the drugs part. And with that, we have completed our lesson on 10.1. So just a very quick summary on what we've gone through in this subtopic. 10.1 is on the nervous system. We started by talking about the organization of the nervous system, and then we talked about the formation of resting and action potential. You do need to remember this graph and what each phases in this graph is. You also learn about the characteristics of a nerve impulse. You learn to describe the structure of a synapse and also explain the mechanism of synaptic transmission, how the message is transferred from here to this side. And last but not least, you were able to compare transmission of impulse across the synapse and along the axons and explain the mechanism of action of drugs on the nervous system. So it's quite a lot in 10.1. I do hope you take your time using the worksheets and all the available resources to learn. And that brings us to what you should do now. So go through the parts that you don't understand so much, complete worksheet 10.1, which you can find in the Google Classroom. And after you're done with the worksheet 10.1, you can also use it as a completed worksheet for your notes. And remember, when you come across any drawings, I highly encourage you to redraw the drawings on your own as well. Apapalukisan, terutama niya macam synapse, dukis balik supaya kamu lebih ingatan, lebih faham. So that's it for me for this part of the lesson. Thank you very much for your time and your attention, and I will see you again in the next one. Thank you, and bye.